but I always took the time to speak to the cops. The biggest concern for me is when people lay out their subordinates.
Oh, yeah.
To me, that's a deal breaker. If you make a mistake, hey, you know what, let's talk about it, we'll fix it. You need some hours, we'll adjust your hours, that's fine. You start calling out and laying out your subordinates.
Welcome back to the Aega A Police podcast. Here with your host, Marlon Marrache. Another special guest, Coach 6 with Al. Let me ask you something. You were a Marine. My question that I have for you is that did you at least think about the Navy or the Air Force or the Coast Guard, or when you were in high school, you just said, you know what, I'm going to be a Marine?
Yeah, I saw those uniforms, I saw the professionalism, and I had several friends who were the Marines already. And I went the right way. I went to the Marine Corps.
You know what? I got to ask you, was there anything else that you wanted to do at a high school, or is that just something that you just, you know what, I had my mind set on it, and away you went to a boot camp? Yeah,
I left the boot camp a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks after I graduated high school. I was gone. I had already made up my mind when I was 17. I had to get my mom to get approval because you're a minor. So she actually signed a letter of consent for me to enlist before my age of 18.
Just out of curiosity, were your parents like, what?
My dad passed when I was 2, but my mom, raised us, and she did a good job raising us. But she was shocked. I mean, I think she was nervous, and more importantly, she was more concerned about my safety. Yeah. When I enlisted in '88, there wasn't any battles going on. I think Beirut had occurred, and a couple, Panama had occurred. And soon thereafter, of course, we had the Persian Gulf.
Correct. Yeah. Did you catch a little bit of the Persian Gulf?
So we got deployed for the Persian Gulf. I didn't make it in country, but we were activated in support of the Persian Gulf.
Okay, yeah. So here we are, Coach 6 at in the Marines, and at some point you didn't re-enlist, and LAPD. Here we go. Yep. Was it just LAPD only, or?
So I actually applied for the Sheriff's Department and the LAPD. When I came on, it was soon after the Rodney King incident, and there had been a hiring freeze for several years, I recall. So LAPD and the sheriffs were not hiring for a period of time. They were having financial issues, somewhat similar to what they're having now, and I applied for both. The Sheriff's Department notified me. The Sheriff's Department wanted me to work, but I really did not want to work the jails for 5 years.
Yeah.
So I decided to apply, for LAPD simultaneously, and it took a little longer, but I was hired with LAPD fairly quickly. I think it was about 9 months after I applied. I was notified.
Good. And so here we are. I think we kind of discussed this a little bit, May of 1993, and this is an internal affairs, a police podcast. Just out of curiosity, when you first saw, I know we know each other because we worked together in the past, but when you saw an internal affairs police podcast, what was like your first thoughts, just out of curiosity?
Well, it's good. I mean, it's really exposing a lot of issues that we have with the system. Biggest problem now, and I'm referring to LAPD alone, is the overwhelming number of cases that we've dug ourselves into. We've dug ourselves into a significant problem of being able to just create an environment of investigating everything, and many things don't need to be.
That was my follow-up question. What do you think, as now you have the outside lens, what do you think that we can do different to alleviate this overwhelming amount of complaints?
Well, I never worked internal affairs. I was never in charge of internal affairs, and I never oversaw internal affairs. I had a lot of confidence in those investigators. They have over 200 investigators that are assigned to internal affairs full-time. I always questioned the number of cases they had. I always looked at the number of cases I had as a young patrol sergeant back in 2000 and what some patrol sergeants are carrying now in the field, yet they're doing use of forces, they're doing other investigative. Mind you, they're also overseeing their personnel in the field. And then you had internal affairs investigators, that's all they did. Yet they only carried, some of them only carried 8 to 10 cases if they were, at the max. So I think what we're looking at is a situation where the departments dug themselves so deep in a hole because we investigate everything. And here's an example. During COVID, we used to argue the point of why are we initiating personnel complaints for mass complaints? Think about the number of complaints that generated for the department, for field supervisors, for many to have to investigate unnecessarily. If you went to an outside agency surrounding LAPD, they weren't taking personnel complaints on masks.
No, they weren't.
We were drilling ourselves into a cave so deep that we dug ourselves to a point where our investigators had no time to conduct thorough investigations on real cases that they had to investigate because they were so overwhelmed with cases.
And I take it your concerns, or if you will, went to deaf ears.
Well, unfortunately, in an environment at LAPD and many other large organizations, the micromanaging was to an extent. It's incredible some of the recommendations you brought forward, and they were just because we've done it like this the last 50 years, we're going to continue to do it. Makes no sense, but we're going to continue to do it because that's how we've done it.
God, that's spot on. I love that comment. That's the way we always did things. So you know what? We'll just continue to do them.
Yeah, bury ourselves in a hole.
Exactly, which brings you to the point because you were a young cop in the mid-'90s. You can agree with me, and I have some guests that come in and kind of educate me back in the Rampart so-called scandal. Mm-hmm. But what I do know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is when Chief Parks became chief in 1997, his first special order was, you know what? Zero tolerance. We have to take every single complaint, which means that sergeants don't have that discretion that they used to have before. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I was a young sergeant in 2000, and I fell into that because we had no really responsibility as a supervisor to try to mitigate their concerns. A lot of those concerns were just misunderstandings between a motorist, a police officer, a resident, and a police officer handling a call for service. And us as supervisors should have that ability to be able to mitigate that. And now with body-worn, digital, and car video, we can immediately mitigate that and not have to generate a personnel complaint, not only destroying morale, but also creating a work environment for personnel investigators, internal affairs investigators, overwhelming them with the number of cases they have.
Yeah, you know what? The only thing that I would add to all that is, look, that happened in 1997. It's 2025.
Yeah.
But hey, that's just the way we do things. And it just sucks because you're right. I mean, can you imagine being a sergeant in today's policing, big agency, small or medium? You can be overwhelmed with a lot of tasks. Yes. And to have a zero tolerance with complaints doesn't quite really make sense.
It doesn't. And unfortunately, it not only overwhelms the investigators, but the leadership that has to review those and adjudicate those, it overwhelms them too. Because are we able to look at every body-worn video that's associated with every personnel complaint as a captain? We should. We should be able to. Unfortunately, you can't because you have boards of rights. You have use of force boards. You have all these other responsibilities. And a lot of times we delegate that responsibility to those that we feel confident in doing that. But it's not always fair to the cops that you're adjudicating cases without having all the facts.
Yeah, no, 100%. Okay, so the question I wanted to ask you, so here you are in 1993, you definitely got an impression of internal affairs. I guess the best way to ask you this is, what impression did you have back in 1993, and has that changed as you sit here today?
Absolutely. So my understanding in 1983, not knowing anything about internal affairs, believing that they were unbiased investigators, very thorough, detailed, unbiased investigations that were presented, and then somebody would look at all the evidence and then make a judge decision, a thoughtful decision on the adjudication. But that's significantly changed. It's very politically motivated. There's in my opinion, we've seen it where they've used it as a tool against people. They use it as a way to tarnish individuals. They're very selective. So I've seen others. We've seen command staff that have been subject of police investigations, and yet you don't hear about it in the news. You don't hear about it. It's very quietly handled.
Yeah.
But then others, if you fall out of grace, they're going to come after you.
Yeah,
Seen that firsthand.
That's definitely a question I got to ask you. But do you think that? Let me ask you this: did anybody come into the academy from internal affairs and say, "Hey, this is who we are. This is what we do. These are our functions"?
I believe they did. I don't recall who it was some time ago. And like anything, we always have that understanding of there are these professionals that are there and they're not there to protect cops. They're not there to bury cops. They're there to have an unbiased view of everything, gather all the evidence, but be thorough. You expect them to be thorough. Right. But I think we created a culture of utilizing it as a tool, to destroy careers. but also we've overwhelmed these investigators. I mean, these investigators now are overwhelmed with just idiotic complaints we shouldn't have even initiated as complaints. And then that takes away time from investigating actual complaints.
Yeah, you know what? I always wonder, even if someone from the academy, even if someone from Internal Affairs comes into the academy and says, "Hey, this is who we are. This is what we do." You can agree with me. I think all we wanted to do is just graduate. Yeah. So it's going to go through one ear out the other. Like, okay, you know what? Yeah, thanks, but I just want to graduate. Right. You know. And then here you are, where you have TOs, and this is kind of like the point I'm trying to make so many people aware. A shout out to everybody who's watching and listening is that there's this negative stigma that's been attached to internal affairs for decades. I mean, here we are in 2025, and we still think of internal affairs like they're this evil entity or they're out to get us. The nicknames are the Rat Squad, the Dark Side. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, that's the perception that's been pushed out. And, you know, and obviously there's incidents that have demonized individuals, you know, destroyed careers, and those people speak out. And I'm not going to say internal affairs is an unnecessary tool. It's very necessary. We need to have them. It needs to be unbiased, and it needs to be managed by the right people, not individuals that are looking for the next step or a career advancement. Yeah. Because we sometimes, if you look at some of the history of internal affairs, we've placed the wrong individuals in there that have failed as leaders in, say, operations. You know, as captains, they were destructive, you know, in how they handled their commands, and yet we're going to put them in charge of very critical investigations, internal affairs investigations that are dealing with personnel and their lives, you know, their freedom potentially and their careers. And yet we're going to put incompetent individuals to lead that task. We're destructive in doing that as leaders. We should be putting sharp individuals that have succeeded as leaders at many arenas in operations and other commands.
Yeah, we do it to ourselves sometimes, you know. And then, of course, my follow-up line is always, hey, we're the thin blue line. You know, we're this family, and we take care of each other. But, you know, you get an IA, I just can't talk to you anymore. Yeah. You know, it just kind of sucks that way. Al, let me ask you this. If you're in a room full of sergeants today, right now, okay, and they're getting ready to begin their internal affairs tour, their assignment, what's the one thing you want them to know about their job?
Well, you know, be thorough. Be thorough on the investigative efforts. You know, don't leave a rock unturned. Be unbiased. Don't be guided by a promotional opportunity and saying, well, this is what the boss wants to hear. Because I saw that. I sat in briefings at the highest level for confidential briefings where you could see the briefing investigators are kind of looking to the chief of police to see if he's acknowledging or at least liking the direction they're moving on these cases. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. This is the facts. This is what we found. This is the evidence we have. Yeah. And you know that briefing is maybe 2 minutes long, and your person's career is relying on that briefing. And if you're only giving them what's important and what the individual getting the briefing wants to hear, and he's acknowledging that because that's the direction they want you to go, guess what? That's where it's going to go. You can guide it anywhere you want to go. So as new investigators, be thorough, be neutral, unbiased, and more importantly, hold your ground. Very challenging times coming up for LAPD again, as we see with staffing numbers. Somebody's got to make a strong decision and say, we're not going to do that anymore because we don't have the personnel to do that. We can't be initiating personnel complaints. Somebody takes a deep breath and they didn't like it. Yeah. We're going to cut a face sheet for that. Right. That's somebody's workload that's increasing now because we don't have to. Somebody can be a leader and say, stop that. We're not doing that anymore. Yeah, and to add into all that is that emotionally, it takes a toll, the morale. I mean, if you're getting complaints for such minor things, like you said, I remember there was one where the motor officer, the way he actually pulled his sunglasses and stared at me, and here we are cutting face sheets. Well, you know what? You do that, and it impacts. I don't think leaders up there really know the impact that one complaint. And I can tell you this from experience because I teach this up and down the state of California. I teach small agencies and medium agencies. Here's the deal. You get an IA in a small agency, like small meaning 20 to 50, you know what? Everybody knows about your IA. Right. Everybody, even the janitor, the maintenance guy even knows about your IA. Where an LAPD, I get it. We're a big machine. Right. We're a big agency. Look, if you cut in a face sheet an IA in Southeast, someone from Devonshire is not going to know, unless it's probably like your ex-partner or your classmate. Hey, bro, I got a 128.
absent that, it's maintained within.
Right.
Would you agree? And what sucks is that even in that division in it itself, to your point, you start making these decisions where you're cutting face sheets on little minor things. It takes an infinite morale, and I don't think. Imagine a 2-year, P2 that proud, he's doing great work, but you know what? The way you actually conducted that traffic stop and you stare at her in a very disrespectful way, we're going to go ahead and cut a face sheet.
Yeah, and you see that a lot with patterns of officers that are productive. Where you get a gang officer. I would argue this point because I was heavily involved in the gang process.
Yeah.
I started up South Bureau gangs. I worked South Bureau gangs. I worked as a Bureau gang coordinator. So I was very strongly suggesting individuals or recommending individuals that were very productive. That's the type of individuals you wanted.
Right.
Unfortunately, with that creates an environment of sometimes a lot of complaints.
A lot of bias.
Because they're proactive.
Correct.
So you see the number of stops, you see the number of citations, the number of arrests, and then you calculate that based on the individual's productivity. If you see an individual who makes one stop a week, yet he's getting a complaint, he just doesn't know how to talk to people. You may not want him in a gang unit.
Right.
But if you have an individual that's very productive, take a look at that body worn. Is he just not talking to people, or is he just stopping the right people in a gang environment, in a gang unit? They're not going to be the most happy people when they get stopped. So I was always the one pushing to try to get those productive gang officers in there. But it's hurtful to them when you're initiating complaints on individuals that we shouldn't be cutting complaints on for.
Going back to internal affairs, let me ask you this. You think the job of an internal affairs investigator is to protect cops? What do you think?
No. Their job is as I mentioned many times, it's an unbiased investigation, neutral investigation. Their job is to bring facts to the table and present those on all levels, whether they're negative, whether they're positive to help the cop. They have to be thorough, and that's their responsibility. They can't be there to protect cops, nor they can be there just to bury cops, because we do have those that just want to look to that investigation where the individual gets stopped, and then we're gonna add an allegation of no front license plate because we can.
Yeah.
That's the kind of person we don't need at internal affairs.
100%. But doesn't it always, because you work gangs a lot too, in your career, that's where you have like the bulk of your experience as you moved up the ranks. But let me ask you this, though. Isn't it sometimes like when someone wants to make a complaint and you're the sergeant, you're very defensive, like, you know what? No, we're not taking that complaint. It's almost kind of like I'm not going to say we're like re-victimizing, the complainant, but that happens too. And I think that's something that we can work on. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I've seen it both ways. I've seen people that they want to cut them off. You have no right to make allegations. But I think 9 out of 10 times, and we don't take the time, is to explain to the person, the complainant, why we stopped them. Hey, man, I'm sorry. Explain to them as a person, not like a gangster or a person that you're talking down to. Hey, this is why we stopped you. And I'm sorry you feel that way. It's okay to apologize. But a lot of times we kick them to the curb and we expect them to be okay with that, and it's not going to work. We wouldn't like it.
Yeah, don't come here and make complaints against my officers. It happens a lot, and you're right. It's a fine line because sometimes I agree. I think you're probably speaking from experience where you've seen sergeants and lieutenants, or even captains, go into internal affairs to get to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Or it's self-serving.
Yeah, I've seen some of the most incompetent captains be placed in internal affairs positions and promoted from there on, only because they guided those complaints where the chief wanted.
Which brings me to my next point, and I wanted to ask you this also: is we talked about a little earlier. I got to ask: is there a double standard?
Yeah, there is. It's not a fair process we have. I think we've created an environment of culture. Internal affairs. From seeing, again, I never worked internal affairs. I never oversaw internal affairs. I never really even I spoke up a lot about how we handled things. I didn't agree with that. We were cutting face sheets a lot. And looking back in my career, both as a captain and an adjudicator at the command level, there's some complaints that I looked at closely, reduced the number of days. I took a close look at those. But there's some that, too, I didn't think they were appropriately, and I gave more days. But I always took the time to speak to the cops when they didn't feel, even as an assistant chief, I took the time to call cops in on complaints where they were a little controversial.
Okay.
And I explained my position. I had one not too long before I retired where I called the individual and the cop, and he'd made an inappropriate comment in a text thread. And I had a conversation with him and somebody at the league explaining why my rationale was. And, you know, really sometimes you just want to hear that the cops acknowledge or at least understand why you're doing what we're doing. And I think we owe it to them. You know, at the end of the day, they may not agree with your decision.
Right.
But we took the time to do that.
Now, in that particular case, did that accused take some accountability?
No,
you can recall?
I don't think so. I think, you know, in his mind, I didn't do anything wrong. You know, it was just a statement. You know, I didn't care that you know, it was a comment that I believe, you know, it was in poor taste. You know, it was, in my opinion, it could be construed as a racist comment.
Okay.
And you know, when you have an individual with that particular race on that text thread, we're being insensitive. And you should at least say, hey, I'm sorry I did that. I shouldn't have done that. And you move on from it. But if you're saying there's nothing wrong with what I did, then I think I can't help you in that instance.
Right.
You know, it's unfortunate.
Right. Now, speaking of a double standard, because I did ask Deputy Chief Mark Perez, the GOAT. Shout out to Mark, who...
Good man. Good
yeah,
leader.
yes. He made me feel... I shouldn't say he made me feel. He actually made me realize that in terms of a double standard, I always use the example, look, if a command staff officer gets a DUI and a 5-year police officer gets a DUI, you know, sometimes, well, you know what, we're not really going to jam the command staff officer up, but we're certainly going to jam the 5-year officer, you know. And he says something along the lines like, well, what you have to understand, Marlon, is that command staff officer, whether, you know, you try to hide it under, you know, or sweep it under the rug, their career's over.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I agree. There's been instances, matter of fact, in my book, I'm outlining quite a few of them where command staff have multiple times been involved in incidents they shouldn't have been involved in. They quietly, you know, kept that, you know, silent. Yet we had a young cop that did the same thing, and it was obviously a lot harsher in his case. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think there's been command staff on this department that have been taken care of throughout their careers, you know, for multiple incidents.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. We'll talk about your book a little later on. Look, here you had a 30-plus year career.
31 years.
31 years. What I wanted to ask you is, right off the bat, what comes to mind, give me a highlight of something that you're very, very proud of throughout the ranks, if you will.
One of the things I'm really proud of is my operational career. I worked operations pretty much my entire career. Sergeant, police officer, lieutenant, captain. You know, I was in charge of area commands. Same thing was as a deputy chief, a commander. And for some reason, I always seem to have a significant amount of responsibility put on me, which I enjoy. You know, I was in charge of planning the Super Bowl in LA. I was actually part of the planning team. I started the planning team for the Olympics in that are coming to LA. So I think the highlights are just my ability to just solve a lot of the problems that I think that were put in front of me. You know, I was in charge of the incident commander during the Nipsey Hussle incident. Nipsey Hussle, that was a handful. You know, that was a responsibility that I didn't take lightly. But I was a brand new commander in South Bureau, back in South Bureau. Yeah, that's where I spent most of my career.
Right.
And I think I was there a week when Nipsey Hussle happened, and I was in charge of it. You know, and I had a captain there by my side that I still to this day scratch my head about, you know, how we made captain. You know, but here we are, and we got to deal with it. But you know, I think going back to your question, I think the highlight is just the experiences, the stories I can tell. I mean, I'm proud of my experiences, but also the assignments that I've had.
That's awesome.
You know?
That's awesome. That's good to know. If I were to put you back in LAPD today, tell me about that one job that you thought of, right? That you wanted to do, but you just never had an opportunity to do it.
You know, actually, one of the jobs I put in for as a lieutenant, I was a lieutenant for about 2.5 years by then, and I put in for the SWAT commander. There had been an opening in the SWAT commander position, and I took that. I put the application in, and I had a good conversation with one of my mentors, and who ultimately passed away. But he coerced me. He says, you know, that wasn't your path. And, you know, I had already worked Metro as a sergeant for 3 years.
Okay.
So I had been there in Boy Platoon, and I enjoyed Metro. But I think we don't the Metropolitan Division is not used as it should be, in my opinion, to an extent. Now we don't use them for crime suppression. There's a lot of negative stigma, unfortunately, associated with Metro. They're great trainers and they're great at what they do. But that would have been the job that I would have probably gone to and stayed.
You would have stayed?
Yeah, I would have stayed, yeah.
So promotion Louisiana came out, you're like, nah, I'm good.
I would have, yeah. It's just an incredible job. The level of knowledge that our commanders, or not our commanders, the SWAT commanders have in those tactical operations was very intriguing to me, and that was a good position to have.
No, 100%. Here we are as an adjudicator, so that would take you from, I probably would say lieutenant, right? Because lieutenants kind of help out with adjudications, right? All the way up to the top. I suppose, what do you take in consideration when you're trying to adjudicate an internal affairs complaint?
Well, you first read the whole complaint, you read the investigation, you look at any associated evidence, body worn, you take a look at, letters, the initial allegation, and see if it matches. You look at, and you really, you try to at least determine based on what you have. And I don't always look at the history of the individual, because a lot of times you'll have individuals that have multiple complaints, and you can't use that as judgment as this individual.
Yeah, you're about to pass charges. You don't want to go to the past.
He could have had a bad day, and then now we had a complaint, and you're looking at that for maybe an inappropriate comment.
Yeah.
Yet he's had 3 other complaints for no seatbelts or seatbelt violations.
Right.
It's not
taking
associated.
their sunglasses.
Yeah. It's not associated. They're 2 different things. But yet we have leaders that do that. Oh, he has 3 no seatbelt complaints.
He took his sunglasses off and stared at him in a really inappropriate manner.
And then on this one, he said the F word, so we're going to hang him.
God.
That's not what we do. That's not what it's about.
Now, of course, I got to set you up this, because I just thought about this lately. I've been, because I do consult, and, I listen to a lot of audio and I compare it to their paraphrase. So, I got to ask you that question. Now, as you sit here and reflect today, could you have, or anyone, doesn't have to be you, but whose job is it to actually listen to audio of all witnesses and compare that to the paraphrase statement of the internal affairs investigation? Because you can agree with me that paraphrase kind of guides you a certain way about the story. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I've seen those recently where the investigator is not only just kind of being too non-efficient, if you will. He's just cutting corners, maybe just trying to get through this case because it's so long and there's 8 witnesses that he has to paraphrase, and he's kind of shortening those statements a little bit more than he should have. And he's not very thorough, but yet the way he guides that verbiage can guide the reader or the adjudicator as to how to make a decision. Oh, he must be guilty because the witness said he saw him. Well, it doesn't mean he saw him. Maybe he was present and he thinks he saw him. But that's not what we're saying in there. We're saying he saw him. And that's a big impact there. If you're saying, I saw him commit that act as an officer, but yet the individual says, well, I think he did that because I was in that area. Somebody did it. It could completely be off, but yet that investigator can guide that by poorly transcribing those statements.
In addition to that, he can ask it in a very improper way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He can guide the witness.
Hey, Al, you were there on First in Los Angeles, right? Isn't that right, Al?
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute.
Sure, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. You're like, that doesn't say that here, right. So what I wanted to ask you this, because, we have the lens where we're outside looking in. Whose job is that to do that? Who do you think? Should it be the captain? I know probably a bureau, maybe the commander or the deputy chief is too busy. Certainly not in internal affairs. Maybe they should. I don't know. But it's certainly at the chief level, no. But who do we designate to, hey, before I make a decision, especially for something that's very serious, false statement, misleading statement, perjury, and unbecoming conduct off duty, that's just, it's horrible. Body-worn video, cell phone video on social media and the whole 9. Whose job is to ensure that, I have to listen to every single one of these audios and compare it because I don't want to be misguided. Like we were talking earlier, we want to turn every single stone, and I want to make a decision, a very reasonable one, equitable and fair and impartial. And who does that?
Well, it's supposed to be the investigator. The investigator is tasked with presenting that case on a neutral basis.
Okay.
But as I mentioned, if that investigator is either A,
Right.
overwhelmed, or B, just trying to get, some points with that adjudicator,
Right.
then we're not going to expect that. So now myself as adjudicator have to be more thorough in reviewing that.
Right. So then,
it's
okay.
presented.
So let's put the IO on the side. Let's just say they are biased. Checks and balances. Who else should do that?
The
Or do
adjudicator,
we?
yeah. We have to.
You should take the time to do it.
You have to now, because that's somebody's career, that's somebody's life.
Now, you and I both know there's 80 plus captains. Does it happen a lot?
No.
Yeah. Should we do it more?
We should, but again, we have to go back, and it's a big leadership challenge now for us at the department to eliminate this wasteful investigative, and then focus on those that are truly important.
Yeah. No. Hey, I think I said it with Doretta, I'll hook you guys up. We can make the 128.01 amend, and it doesn't even have to go into teams. You don't even have to push the CF number to generate a number.
It could be a log entry.
Right.
Yeah,
or even
entry.
on the log.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? We're good to go.
Yeah. We even demonstrably false complaints, we're still having to investigate them, and it's still a
God.
personnel complaint. Yet that could be reviewed by the supervisor at scene, attached video to the log, create an incident number, and associate that entry, and it could be audited to ensure that the sergeants are doing the proper work. But it eliminates an investigative process.
Oh, 100%. I've done DFs. My last assignment at Transit Services Division, and dude, even if you tell the, hey, you know what, body worn video is going to be demonstrably false, you're good to go. But they have to wait like 3-6 months
Exactly.
for them to actually go into teams to and say, okay, it's done. And you're right. There's got to be a better way.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so talk to me about. Here's the other question I had for you: we already kind of touched this? Internal affairs, or should I say, could internal affairs be weaponized?
Absolutely. I've seen it. Unfortunately, recently we see the mission division. I was in some of those initial briefings on that case, and it was shocking to me to see the captain that was briefing these cases, and the deputy chief. They were so excited about this investigation, almost like, look what I found. And yet, when you were asking, when they were asking questions about certain things associated with it, there's a very small. It was obviously there's some level of misconduct there initially on the initial briefing, but it wasn't to an extent. They were presenting this as a Rampart, 2.0, and I think initially, as the initial investigators or the people that are capturing this, just bring the facts. Just present hey, this is all I've got so far, but we're going to look further into it. That's how you present it. You don't present it as like we've uncovered a monster, because already in my mind they're already biased in what they're doing.
Yeah. Do you also feel, Al, that sometimes weaponization happens within, like, meaning if you and I worked, in a unit, and I just felt like you did something inappropriate, or, it's kind of like borderline alleged misconduct, if you will. But you know what? I'm going to call internal affairs and use them as a weapon to get you in trouble. What do you?
Absolutely. You know how many anonymous letters are being received? How many workplace issues are being brought to attention? I mean, I've handled workplace issues where people call me and they say, I was moved. I was moved out of my command or out of my assignment because they said they needed me for this task force, yet nobody explained to me why I was moved. And I said, no, you can't do that. And we've created that. We've created that environment. That workplace issue creates more. Look at a lot of lawsuits the city's paying out on workplace issues.
Yeah. How do you fix that? What do you think? Or is it fixable?
Well, I
suppose yes.
Yeah, there are leadership challenges. There's leaders that don't want to take on the tough tasks of managing, those tough environments. I've had difficult employees as a captain. When I was a captain at Hollenbeck, I had this community relations sergeant that was, he wanted to work from 9 to 4 because he just didn't think it was necessary for a Crow sergeant to work at night, because there was no events at night. Okay. And yet, any time I asked him about an event, he would put it on his personnel and throw them under the bus. And so I challenged this individual. I called him to task, and I had other command staff from other commands, his friends, intervening on his behalf. And we create that environment because we create entitlements to personnel. Well, that's how I've always done it. I've always worked 9 to 5 or 9 to 4 because it's convenient for me. And then when you put people out or inconvenience them, we're cops, for God's sakes. We work whatever hours we're told to work.
Yeah.
You know, we're creating an entitlement. We're creating an environment. So same thing with those workplace issues. Captains aren't calling people out for just stupid things. You know, hey, you shouldn't put that sticker on your wall because it's going to offend somebody. Call them out. Say, hey, take that shit down.
Yeah.
Don't put it up there. Problem solved. Or they wait till it becomes a problem and now it's too late.
Let me tell you, yes, the sergeant probably called and said, oh my God, I can't believe I've been called out.
Absolutely. He called his friends through every command throughout the city. And, you know, of course, he wouldn't say that he was, you know, not only incompetent, but he was unwilling to do any work or putting the biggest concern for me is when people lay out their subordinates.
Oh, yeah.
To me, that's a deal breaker. You know, if you make a mistake, hey, you know what, let's talk about it. We'll fix it. You need some hours, we'll adjust your hours. That's fine. You start calling out and laying out your subordinates, that's a deal breaker.
Yeah. And of course, we've seen this movie before where if they call and they say, well, you know what, I want to remain anonymous.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The letters too.
Yeah, the letters. Or let's just say you had this confrontation, right? And then about a week later, you get a letter. And then you think to yourself, is this really anonymous? Like, you already know how the players are. Right. You're like, okay, look, there's only like 3 people that should know this. Me, the person who wrote the letter, and maybe this other 2. And those other 2 weren't the ones that were facilitating this complaint. In other words, they didn't come to you and say, you know, hey, look what's happening to me. So it can't be those 2.
No.
It's not me because I had the conversation with that person. So, and we take it and we make it worse. I always thought to myself, how can we fix and streamline this process? I think one way, and maybe you can agree with me, is when you do call internal affairs and you have concerns that might be alleged misconduct, you know what? Why don't you do like a pre-screening, pre-inquiry, right? So for example, you're the captain over at Hollenbeck, and here I am, I answer the phone, and someone from Hollenbeck saying, hey, you know what? This person's doing A, B, and C. Then we'll take your example, you know. Okay, you know what? Give me about 48 hours, and I'll get back to you. You know, let me look into this. Right. And you hang up, and then I call you and say, hey, Cap, you know, I got this person giving me a call about this, and that. Is there any merit to that? That's fair. Right. Is there any merit? Do you believe it's alleged misconduct? We all know what misconduct is, right? Criminal offense, neglect of duty, violation of policy and procedure, or CUBO. Mm-hmm. And you're like, it's not those 4. Mm-hmm. Okay, you know what, Roger that, thank you. And then call that person back and say, you know what? Mm-hmm. Unless you have other evidence to substantiate the complaint you want to make against your peers, I'll be more than glad to do that, and we'll initiate a complaint and investigate it. But if you don't, then you know what? We're not going to do it.
Yeah, I'm just asking somebody to do their job. And it's not a personnel complaint.
Yeah, and you know what? We don't do that.
Right.
There's got to be a better way.
And it's similar to a field sergeant, you know, out in the field. You know, if they have all the effort or all the tools in their hand to adjudicate or not even make a complaint, then we should empower them to do that. But the system now won't allow that.
Yeah. You know? Yeah, you're out there in the field as a field sergeant, and my understanding is, this got me under, I got a little hot about this, where the sergeant, after 15 minutes talking to the possible complainant, has to ask, in the end, would you still like to make a complaint? I mean, come on, look, if you're talking for 15 minutes and you're explaining what the officers did, their performance, their duties, and you know there wasn't any, in your mind you're thinking there's just no misconduct, I don't think that we should be asking and catering to say, hey, you know what, do you still want to make a complaint, you know? Yeah. And then we do.
Yeah, quick example of one. This one irks me, and still this day, I'm going to cover a little bit more in the book on this one, but it was a good councilman from the south end was pulled over on a traffic stop by patrol officers. And the individual made an illegal U-turn. The officers stopped him. He had blacked out windows, tinted windows. They pull him over. Immediately says, you stopped me because I'm black.
Okay.
They didn't know that. The windows are black. The wife says, no, the wife was agreeing with the officers because they were explaining to her, it's all on body worn. Yet they initiated a personnel complaint because it was a council member. These officers sweated this because they were worried about their career. You know, here's a councilman alleging racial discrimination. This councilman went to the media and released this. And we had the video to disprove it. And we should have released that video. I pushed for that video release, but it was denied. Because that video should have been released immediately to put that councilman out on task for calling out our cops, and to also disprove that whole racial thing that a lot of people play. And unfortunately, it was held, and these cops sweated out. Ultimately, they were cleared because the video was clear that they didn't know he was black, or he committed a traffic violation. But that's a clear example of a situation that should have not gone that far.
Yeah. Worst incident in your career?
You know, there's a lot of capers I could talk about. I had some great capers as a young cop, as a sergeant, as a gang sergeant. I got in some pretty good capers with my cops. But I would say the worst situations is going to incidents where cops have been injured or killed. You know, I was a young police officer, brand new. I think I was out 3 months when Chuck Heim was killed over on Sunset. And I responded with my training officer to that incident where they were carrying him out to the hospital. Hollywood Press ultimately died. They were doing a parolee rollback, if I recall correctly, and the individual fired through the door and killed him. He was a mounted officer that was working overtime, and he was killed. And I think the second one was when Anzora was hit by a vehicle in Newton. I was a fairly new deputy chief in Central Bureau, and he was hit by a car in Newton Division directing traffic at a traffic scene. And I remember responding to the hospital, and his family was there. And, you know, he was alert. I didn't get a chance to talk to him, but he was initially alert, and he looked like he was making it. And I remember, you know, updating the chief and say, "I think we'll be okay. I think he's going to make it." And several days later, he ended up dying from his injuries. Oh. And I tell you, it was probably one of the most difficult things as a chief, because you feel so helpless. You know, you want to help the family. There was a lot of emotions involved with his cops, his peers. It was a very difficult situation, you know. So I can lay out great pursuits, but I think the most difficult thing as a leader had been watching a cop die and then attending the funeral.
You know, I meant to ask you, back in 1993, when I came out in 98, mental wellness was nothing. It wasn't at the forefront, you know. In other words, when we think of mental wellness, we think of a partner, you know, committing suicide, or losing a partner in the line of duty, you know, just very tragic events, and we put those, you know, up on the shelf when we think of mental wellness. Would it be fair to say that today, should we include discipline? Should we include something along the lines like, your career's on the line and you're going to go to this Board of Rights and you're facing termination?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things as a captain, I always did, and those are the folks that were IOD. You know, you get those individuals that are assigned home, you know, or not assigned home, but, you know, pending a recovery from an injury, and we forget about them. So every month or of a holiday, I would call these individuals, you know, and just check on them. Hey, how are you? You know, and same thing with individuals assigned home, you know. But we don't do that. You know, we kind of kick them to the curb, and it's like they have leprosy. We can't talk to them, you know, and they're dealing with some of the worst situations of their life.
You did say we don't do that. Should we do that more?
Absolutely. It should be a no-brainer leadership, you know, opportunity for us to shine and help our people during the most difficult times.
Yeah. You reflect on it now more than you did before? Because in the moment, you're probably, you know, you tried your best, and I get it. Captains are busy, which I meant to ask you also. I didn't mean to divert, but you were a lieutenant back in
2014.
2014. So that was about 11 years ago. Yeah. Do you think the job of a lieutenant is overwhelming today than it was in 2014? What do you think?
I think they are. I think they're understaffed. You know, the number of incidents that we've put on their table, the more workload that we're putting on them, I think is much more significant. You know, and I think we're creating that environment. We're putting too much responsibility on these individuals, and they start cutting corners.
Would that be fair to say as captains as well?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Today's captain compared to 2014, less work? I shouldn't say less work.
I think there's more work. There's much more body-worn video to review, digital in-car video. You know, we're putting more people in REMAC, unprecedented number of people in REMAC just because they're breathing wrong. And, you know, we're self-creating this environment there. It's a very destructive environment that's not helping. You know?
Which leads me to your book, man. Tell me a little bit about the book, man, because you know you got to come back and talk about it.
Oh, I will. It's looking like August of this year. We'll be ready to roll it out. And it's really just, it talks a lot about my childhood growing up, my time in the Marine Corps, but it's a lot of lessons learned, in the LAPD. It's called Unwavering Strength. And but it talks about my personal growth incidents, things that I made mistakes in, things that I still think about, and I'm like, I wish I would have done this. There's always things that we could do better, and I'm going to reflect on those. But I also saw a lot of stupidities that the department made, and did, and I've really identified a lot of those. And as I started the writing process and people learned about it, they reached out to me with stories that they had heard of, and so it's interesting. I think it's a good opportunity for us to really look as a department of, we are the LAPD was the greatest department at one time. Yeah. Are they now? I think we've dug ourselves too deep in a hole. I think, professionally, we're still some of the most professionally looking officers, but in the background, we destroy our own, we kill our own, and we have some of the, we have strong leaders, but they're silenced. If you speak up too much, you're outspoken about things that are going wrong, you're silenced, and we should be embracing those leaders. We should be listening to them and trying to support those leaders and building them up, not excluding them.
You think the book will help maybe shape the department better?
I think it'll open a lot of eyes.
Okay.
I think people are going to say, wow, we didn't know it happened. Those things were happening. And I think hopefully people will learn from that. At least, folks that are moving into the organization or moving up in the organization, I think they'll learn from it. And I'm hopeful that we all learn lessons from it.
Yeah, there's, and I appreciate you even saying that, there is some accountability on your part. We don't get to look at it until we're actually out of the game, if you will, right? And I suppose when you were the assistant chief, when you were the deputy chief, there's probably things that you could have done different and handled.
Well, absolutely. And even then, I remember growing up as a young cop saying, if I ever promote, I wasn't one of those that, I have to get to the next level. I worked hard. What can never accuse me of being lazy? I was always in the community. I was always doing my job. Yeah. I was always hitting roll calls. I was always trying to be out there with the cops, but I always would listen to them. I was a big supporter of the league. If the league called me on something, I would support it. And they didn't always agree with my direction, but I took the time to listen to them.
Yeah, we can't always agree on everything.
Right. And then even with cops, I remember as a captain, there was this one cop, senior cop, been around for a long time, probably one of the most senior P3s in the division. And he made a really bad decision when it came to a vehicle pursuit. He ultimately disregarded the direction of the watch commander, which the watch commander was on par on his decision not to allow a pit. He circumvented that, and he ended up pitting this vehicle. It was a heavy vehicle. He shouldn't have been doing it. So I called him in, and it was one of those conversations where I brought the training coordinator in, and I said, hey, you shouldn't be doing that and training P1s to do that. And in his mind, he did nothing wrong. Yeah. I'd do it again. Yeah. So I said, well, I can't have you training, P1s in that matter, because that's not going to help the P1, and it's going to get you guys killed. And I'm not doing anything about it. So he and I disagreed on that. Ultimately, he left and ended up retiring early. And that wasn't my intention. My intention was just for him to say, you know what, I shouldn't be training P1s that way, and I'll work at it. Yeah. And we would have been okay with that. Yeah. But the reason I brought that up is because I've always always kind of push myself to do that every time, to at least make it an educational point for everybody when we make mistakes.
Would it be fair to say sometimes cops don't like to hold themselves accountable?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we're all guilty of that at one point, where we've got the egos, type A personalities. Yeah. But I think we need to all be better at that and learn from others' mistakes and our own mistakes and acknowledge them.
Yeah, no, it's part of life. You fall down and, pick yourself right back up and do better. Hey, man, we're almost at the end. I'm going to leave the floor up to you. Any advice you have for anyone who is applying right now to become a police officer? What advice do you have for them? What do you think?
Enjoy. It was a great 31 years. I have some good memories, some great friends, good experiences, both good and bad, very scary situations, that made me stronger. But one of the things that I think I would recommend really strongly to individuals, especially young officers with families, is don't deprive your family of your time. One of the things I learned the hard way in my career was I was dedicated to the job. I lived and breathed LAPD. If I got called out, I was the first one to raise my hand and run out there. I was aching to respond to incidents because I think I could have, I felt that I could provide something to it. But at the end of it, I was depriving my children, I was depriving my families from it. you know, and when you finish your career, you know, you're going to be replaced within minutes, you know, or even before you leave.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't an issue that I thought I was irreplaceable. It just, I thought that's my commitment to this department, but I shortened my family's ability to see me more. You know, I think so. My request to them is take time for your family. You know, make your family count, make your children count, because that time you can never make up. This place will continue.
Yeah.
Your career, the agency will continue with or without you, but your family, you know, those memories will pass you and you'll never come back to them.
Wow. You know what I did forget to ask you is what are you doing now? I mean, what's going on, man? How can we get a hold of you?
So we've got a great opportunity that we launched, a company called Assured International Protection. I have a great group of partners, special forces, law enforcement, and then we've had some private security experts that join. There's 5 partners in this company. And we're doing some work here in the community, but we're going to be also offering opportunity for security officers. But currently, we're doing a lot of cybersecurity and threat assessments throughout the city at vulnerable sites. And it's a great opportunity to use a lot of the connections that we've established as police officers and law enforcement. But also, it's a great service that I think a lot of communities and businesses really are requiring now because of the shortened staffing at most police departments. You know, especially LA County. We don't have the numbers that we had before. The response times are significant. So a lot of individuals are looking for private security to bolster their security efforts. And Assured International Protections offers a wraparound full-service security process for all these companies.
That's good, man. Well, you know, we'll put all the information on the episode. Hey, man, anything I forgot, you know, before we wrap it up? You know, I'm going to do like that IA question. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us before we go off the record?
My bad. I forgot to congratulate you on your success on the podcast. The work you guys are doing, you and many others, to kind of educate the police officers of the real process. You know, like I said at the beginning, I didn't know, I trusted that Internal Affairs was an unbiased, you know,
well,
neutral.
what did your FTOs tell you?
Well,
didn't they tell you, like, don't talk to those guys?
Don't talk to those guys, hide from them, you know. But we've got to trust them, but we also have to hold them accountable. And more importantly, believe that they're going to do the right thing.
Yeah, you know what? It's the necessary evil to have. I'm a true believer. We should investigate ourselves. We should police ourselves.
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah. I mean, we can have a whole different conversation about civilian oversight, but thank you. You know what? I always wanted to have these conversations because when I retired and I started looking around all these police podcasts, this was that one topic that is very taboo, that we don't really want to talk about. But you know what? It's okay. It's okay to talk about it because I'm sure that there is some accountability, right? And we can learn from it. And that's what we want to do.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for showing up.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Marlon.
Yeah, well, you know, you're going to come back and we can talk about that book.
Oh, absolutely.
And other stuff as well. Like always, please be safe out there and don't forget to go Coach 6. Thank you.